Hi, and welcome to our first full episode of Our WWII Dad. I'm Chris Cangilla alongside my brother Ken Cangilla, and we created this podcast to share stories of our father, Army Private First Class Louis Cangilla, who served in World War II in Europe. You know, Ken, once again, you researched Dad's steps overseas. You recently got back from seeing some of those areas in France, Belgium, Germany, and Norway. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I've always had the desire to really follow in his footsteps and understand what it was like for him when he was an 18-year-old and in the Army. And so I had the opportunity, after having done years of research at home, to go to Europe. And I had some great people to kind of guide me along the way, and did some great research before we left, and was able to really see exactly where he was and understand the action that took place on those battlefields that he participated in 1944 and 1945.
Yeah, it's going to be an incredible journey that we take as well together on this podcast. You know, when we did our preview episode, we got some great responses and comments from a lot of different people, and it really got me excited to kick off this journey, you know, here today.
Yeah, we not only heard, of course, from friends and family that had watched the preview episode and were excited about it, but people we didn't even know who shared their experiences with us and that went on similar journeys regarding their fathers. And it was really great to hear from them.
Right. It's going to be so cool to hopefully continue that, and that people will also, you know, tell us more about what they went through. So let's get started. You know, today we're going to be talking about what America's like near the beginning of the war, and then Dad's first steps in joining, you know, the cause overseas, right?
That's right. We're going to dig into really him leaving home for the first time at age 18, and how he prepared himself to be inserted into this conflict that I'm sure he didn't even really fully understand, but he knew it was his duty to go overseas and do what was required of him.
Yeah, it's a tough thing when you think about, of course, you and I are fathers, and we have young men that are our children, and to imagine them going off to war is just a frightening thing. But
yeah,
you know, we're gonna learn a lot about what Dad has done, and his steps that he took, and we'll have a special guest a little later in the show. But before we get started, what do we know about the start of the war in Europe, you know, and its expansion, and eventually the U.S. entry into World War II?
Yeah. So, you know, at the end of World War I, you know, Germany lost that war, and the repercussions for their economy and for them in their country were very difficult. They had high inflation. A lot of people were disgruntled, and Hitler used that unrest to rise to power and really kind of rally the people behind him. And their conquests began to take on more territory, which they felt was rightfully theirs. And they invaded Poland and Czechoslovakia in September of 1939, and that's really what kind of kicked things off. And then shortly after that, France and Britain declared war against Germany because they had violated really sovereign boundaries. And so Britain and France were committed. So Hitler and the Nazis just turned their full force towards France. And by June of 1940, and Italy had joined with Germany by that time. By June of 1940, France had collapsed, and Germany basically held on to Western Europe at that point in time. Then the U.S. was reluctant to get into another world war. There were still people that were unhappy about the experience in World War I. You lose a lot of people. And so they're reluctant to join into this. It's none of our business. And then Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th, 1941. And when that happens, the U.S. declares war on Japan. And since Japan was an ally of Germany, Germany immediately declares war on the U.S. And now we're into it, you know, 110%. And really, I think FDR, who was president at that time, was kind of happy that he had a good reason to get into the fight, because up until then, we'd just been supplying material to Great Britain.
Yeah, it's an incredible timeline. And when I think about Dad's experience during that timeline, if we place him during those things. You know, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia and Poland. Dad's 14 years old, right? And 2 years later, when the U.S. declares war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, Dad's 16. Can you tell us anything you've discovered about Dad during those years?
Yeah, you know, there's of course not a lot to know just from doing the research, but you know, you got to imagine he's playing sports. He's, you know, just a kid in school doing what every kid does in school at that time. He's young for his grade. When he's in his senior year, he's 17. I was 18 in the fall, and he was 17 when he graduated from high school. And I looked through his yearbook and I found his picture. And if you read, you know, they have a little quote from him and stuff like that. You know, his quote basically was that he was looking forward to going to working and going to night school to continue to get a higher degree. And little did he know that wasn't the plan, because he was going to be doing something entirely different that year after he graduated.
Yeah, his world was turned upside down, as many men his same age just changed overnight. Everybody had hopes and dreams and things that they were going to do, and it completely changed. You know, it seems like we need to learn more about what that time in America was like. You know, we need to talk to somebody who was actually alive and there during that incredible time in our U.S. history. Let's go to our mom. Well, joining us now is our World War II mom. Mom, I can't thank you enough for doing this. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, and thank you for asking me to come.
Mom, it's great to have you on here with us. We got a lot of questions for you about the good old days, so I hope you're ready for some good answers for us.
I will do my very best.
Now, Mom, you know, you didn't know Dad when he actually shipped off to the war, right?
I was 10 years old and in 5th grade when your dad went into the service. So I didn't know him at all.
What was it like, you know, before the war started? I mean, did you feel like something possibly bad was brewing? I know you're a young girl.
No, there was no indication in my life. I didn't hear my parents talking about it or anything. Of course, we didn't have TV and all that sort of stuff, but I wasn't aware that anything was happening.
Mom, how did you first learn about the atrocities that started in Hawaii with Pearl Harbor?
My sister Doris and her boyfriend then had gone to the movies. When they came out, they were selling extra papers, and it said that we were at war. And when they came home, they told us all about it. Of course, we knew then that her boyfriend, Dick, was going to be going into the service. And that's how I found out about it.
Now, Mom, I'm sorry, Ken.
I just have a quick follow-up.
Go ahead. Sorry.
And so that's all right. How soon did Dick go into the service? Do you remember? And where was he stationed?
It was very soon afterwards, but I don't remember the dates or anything. But he went into boot camp, and he was gone for 6 weeks. And my sister Doris went to Mass every morning, and hopefully that he would be in the right place at the right time. Well, they sent him to Africa. And from Africa, they sent him to Italy. And the boy never got home for 3 years. My sister wrote to him every single day.
You know, Mom, you're from a pretty large family like Dad is, too. Did any of your brothers have to serve or anything?
My oldest brother was 17 years older than I was. And he was married and had a child. So he didn't go into the service. But he went and worked at what they called then mine safety. So he was working on war products. What he did then, being just 10 years old, I didn't pay much attention to it. My other brother had a terrible, terrible, serious case of eczema, and they wouldn't take him into the service. But then years later, after he was married, and that was all cleared up, they took him into the Korean War.
So that was your brother, Phil, right?
That's right. Yes.
And how much older is Phil than you?
About 4.5 years.
Okay.
So, Mom, you guys learned about, you know, the start of the war pretty much from the extra and the newspapers that they brought home. What about during the war? How were you getting the information? Nowadays, you know, we look at our social media, we look at television. how are you getting information on what was going on?
Well, we had two papers that were delivered, one in the morning and one in the evening. We kept up with the news that way. And then we had a big Stromberg Carlson manufactured radio that sat in our living room. And of course, our father had controls of that, just like the TVs of today. And we would sit around the radio and listen to the news that way.
Mom, do you remember who was broadcasting back in those days, or what stations did you listen to? Was it like ABC radio, or do you remember the way they addressed it?
I don't remember that. I don't remember any of those.
Okay.
Yeah, didn't pay any attention to them.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we all know that Americans were asked to do what they could, the ones at home, to support the war effort. What did you guys do, or what did you have to do without? Do you remember any of those things?
Oh, yes, I do. Butter and sugar were scarce. And I remember the story my sister told, that she went to the market to buy some pork chops. And she said to the butcher, "I would like 4 nice pork chops." And he said, "Lady, so would I." You couldn't get them. And we had to do without quite a bit. But fortunately, we had an uncle, and I don't know where he got these things, but he got canned goods for us. And so he would give those to my dad. So we had a little extra, and that was kind of nice.
Okay, Mom, the statute of limitations is up. You can name the uncle, and you can say it was the black market.
It was Uncle Moody, and it was the black market.
What kind of stuff was on the black market? Could you get pretty much anything? Chocolate and all that kind of stuff was scarce, right?
Oh, absolutely. But my dad was a produce broker, just like your father was. And he told me about another man down in the produce yards there. And he sold produce right from his store. And if somebody came to him and said, "I want to buy some bananas," he would say, "Fine, but you have to buy 10 sacks of potatoes too." So that's how he made big money. My father would never do that.
Yeah.
But that was the black market. People took advantage of people.
Mm-hmm. Mom, were there other things going on to help support the war? Like tire drives or things like that?
I don't remember that. I just know you prayed that your tires didn't need to be replaced. And there was a shortage of gas. My father had A, B, and C tickets that you would put on your car, stickers. And he had a C ticket, which gave him more gas than most because he couldn't get to work. He worked odd hours and he couldn't use the public transportation. So we had a little bit more gas, but we still had to be very careful how we used it.
Now, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so he would go into work really early in the morning and the streetcar wasn't running at that point in time.
That's right.
So I've heard the stories, I think, in the past that you guys would save bacon grease. What was that about?
Oh, yeah. Oh, anytime that Mom was rendering any kind of meat that had fat on it, she would strain it into an old Crisco can, and we would save it until it was full. Then I would take it to the butcher, and he would give me money for that grease. And I think, Kenny, you know what they used that grease for?
Yeah, I had to look it up, and they actually took that grease and would use it in some fashion to make glycerin that was ultimately put into explosives.
So that's what we did.
I know you're a good cook, Mom, so you weren't poisoning anybody, get rid of it that way, but you might have taken care of some Germans because of the grease that you supplied.
That's right.
Good work there. Let me ask you another question, Mom. A lot of Americans would reach out to servicemen, really make sure that they're sending them care packages and making sure that they're known that they're loved at home and that kind of stuff. Did your family take part in that at all?
Well, my sister Doris did. And she would make cookies, she would make brownies, and my dad would package them up so carefully and send them off to her boyfriend, Dick. Well, this one time she used my mother's mixer. And the next day, my mother went to use the mixer, and a metal nut was missing from the mixer. My sister immediately wrote to Dick, and fortunately, he got the letter before he got the brownies. So when the brownies came, he and his buddies took their little fingers and sifted through all the brownies until they found the metal nut. And he was in Italy at the time, and he mailed it back from Italy.
So at least you can keep that mixer working, even if
Yes.
it's all the way to Italy and back.
Yes.
And quite a few nuts obviously came from Italy, since that's where our ancestry is from.
There you go.
There you go. It's Comedy Central right here. Let me ask you guys, Mom, specifically, what is your most scary memory of that time? When were you the most scared as a little girl during World War II?
Well, I was in grade school at the time. I went to St. Bernard's Catholic School, and it was right next door to the church. And we would have drills, and the alarm would sound, and the nuns would take us over to the basement of the church. And there were rooms down there. What they ever used them for, I don't know. But all the children would sit on the floor in those rooms, and we would say the rosary until the all clear sounded. And that was kind of frightening because you were upset about what was going to happen to you.
In retrospective, we never, we know now that we weren't really threatened here in the United States during this war. But back then, you don't know the capabilities of the Germans or the Japanese or whoever, that would be a real scary thing, right?
Well, they hit Hawaii, didn't they?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm just thinking of the continental United States, and
yes,
you're scared anywhere. What were you going to say, Ken?
Well, just to follow up on that point, the Japanese apparently did get one type of bombing onto the coast of California, and I don't know the exact story about it. So they actually did reach the continental United States. So it wasn't that far fetched. It would have been a lot harder for the Germans, I think. But in that same light, Mom, did you guys have to black out the windows and things like that?
Well, when the alarms sound, we would go down to our basement, and we would have to sit it out there. And we just didn't put any lights on. Now, some of my neighbors, they just blacked out everything. They were very frightened. And we would just stay in the basement till the all clear sounded. And then we would come back upstairs. But, you were talking about getting close to the United States. Your dad and I had gone on vacation, and I believe we were in Massachusetts, I believe it was. And we went out on a tour boat, and the guide said to us, this is where they found a German submarine years after the war. So they came very close.
How far do you think you're off the coast there for that U-boat sighting, Mom? What do you think? Maybe a couple football fields or a couple miles or what?
Yes, that's about it. They could have, I don't know what they would have used, whether they had torpedoes or what, I don't know.
That's
right.
Story. I guess we don't really remember it,
No.
Being a young man like I am, I thought we were safe here, but I guess not, right?
Never. Yeah, don't take it for granted. Yeah. Can happen anytime.
So tell me about the sirens. I didn't know about that. So you would hear some kind of warning system to know when to go to the basement? So they would use like tornado sirens or something?
It was like we had a fire station, maybe 6 blocks away from our house. And it was the city hall and the fire station all together. And when there was a fire, they would make a certain sound, and we could, they go beep, 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 and we would count those, and then we could tell where the fire was we had a schedule, and it would tell us these many beeps means it's on this street. So we knew where the fire was. When the war came, then they just blasted the sirens, and then we knew what it was.
So, did you know many servicemen in the neighborhood, families and that kind of stuff, boys that went away?
My cousins, I had a lot of cousins. And as they went into the service, my dad held a party for each one of them and gave them a savings bond and sent them off that way. And your father had a lot of friends, and some went to the Navy, some went to the Marines, some went to the Army. And a big group of guys, and they all came home in one piece except one. His name was Tubby. I never knew him. And after he passed, then the boys all took up a collection and they bought a beautiful golden chalice with his name engraved on it and gave it to Sacred Heart Church, and they used it at communion time.
And Sacred Heart was the church in East Liberty
Yes.
area of Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. Yeah.
That's where your dad, he went to grade school there, and then he went to Central High School for high school. And then he went to Duquesne University for college.
So how far was your neighborhood from Dad's neighborhood? Where were you at again?
Oh, it was about 10 miles or so.
And that's
yeah.
Dormont, is that right?
Yes, I lived in Dormont. He lived in East Liberty. Yes.
How did you guys meet? I know there's an age difference, but how did you guys meet?
Well, I went to work for my father, who was a produce broker down at the produce yards, and they had an auction, and I would work the auction with my dad. And your dad worked for my dad's competitor, who was still my dad's best friend, Jerry Schwab. And so he worked for him doing the same kind of work I was. Now, your dad was an accountant, of course, I was not. And so that's how I met your dad. And then we started dating. We dated for 2 years and then got married.
That's crazy. So he was an accountant and you were just a looker, right?
That's right. Yeah.
That works for me. Mom,
who approached whom?
Well, see, we had to go into an office after we wrote up these tickets, and they had to get them approved. Well, the young man that got approved them had a crush on me. So he would take care of me first. And that used to make your father mad. And then I would take the tickets down to the produce floor, and my brothers who worked for my dad could get the produce out faster. So I used the feminine technique to get things done.
The looker, once again. Yeah. What do you remember about victory in Europe, victory in the war? What do you remember about that happening and the boys coming home?
Boy, that was wonderful. As I said, my brother-in-law, Dick, was in for 3 years. When he called Doris and said, I'm on my way home, but we didn't know exactly when he was going to be home. And so she waited and waited and waited for another call. And she had to run an errand. So she did. And when she came back, we were all hustling around in the family room and getting ready to go somewhere. She said, where are you all going? And we're going down to the train station and pick up Dick. Wow. So we went and picked up his mother. And my dad said to my sister, you let his mother hug and kiss him first, which she did. So they dated for, I don't know, a year and a half, and then they got married.
So you can appreciate that being a mother of 8 kids, that you would probably want to hug your son before any of our
That's right.
Do.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. So it was nice.
Yeah, I'm just impressed with your memory, Mom, and always have been. Tell people how old you are right now.
I'm 91. I'll be 92 in November.
And Ken and I hope we get your genes.
Yeah. I want to hold on to my jeans for a while.
All right. You may still need to wear them, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Mom, I can't thank you enough for doing this. I know Kenny feels the same way.
It was my pleasure. Of course, I love seeing my boys anyway.
Yeah, it really helps us fill in some gaps. And you've always had a really good memory and really good stories about the old days. And it's amazing what you've seen change, over the years, from going from a little girl that just, listened to the radio or heard their parents read out of the newspaper about an event like that, all the way up to the technology we're using right now. Absolutely.
Yes. It was an interesting time, that's for sure. And how people reacted, and everybody wanted to do their part for the war. I remember buying stamps, and you save them in a book, and then you would get a bond when you filled that up. And everybody was doing that. We all wanted it to end such a way.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Mom, thank you so much for doing this. I hope that you'll be willing to come back on with us, because you know me, I'll get it wrong from time to time, and we need your help in getting more clarification.
I'd be glad to help anytime, Christopher.
Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Mom. You've been great doing this for us, and we look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Okay. Love you guys. Take care.
Love you too. Man, Mom was incredible on that segment. She did such a good job, and she's such a wealth of knowledge. And, at 91, so sharp still to be able to recollect those stories. And she doesn't miss a beat.
No, man, she really doesn't. And you know what amazes me, being in this business a little bit, she knows all this information, but she has this knack for presenting it. It cracked me up internally because I asked her a question, she answered that question, and then she tossed to you to give your opinion on it. It's like she's part of a roundtable discussion group that's on the news. She's great, and there's not much that lady can't do.
No, it's absolutely amazing. I forget, that she is that age because she is so sharp and so with it and so physically fit. I really envy her.
Yeah, she's great. So let's get back into the start of Dad's journey, right? So what do you know about him joining up?
So, as I had mentioned earlier, he was in high school and graduated when he was 17. And so I imagine, I don't know, they probably graduated in May or June of 1943. And I looked at his records that I have on file that I was able to get my hands on. Some of it he kept, some of it I wrote for him, was able to get from the Army or wherever they keep that stuff, and found out that he enlisted. By November of 1943, he was an enlisted man in the Army. And I thought, wow, he didn't waste any time because his birthday is October 28th. And by November 15th, he's enlisted.
That's 1 month after turning 18, right?
Yeah.
That's incredible. I heard a story growing up. I don't know if it's true or not. I want to believe it because I've shared the story over and over again. I don't want to be, thought of as somebody who's not speaking the truth here, but I heard Dad had 3 buddies, right? And they go to the enlistment center. And at those days, I guess they enlisted all branches of the service at one place, right? For the war.
Right.
So Dad and his friends decided that they wanted to maybe go in the same branch. So they have a chance of seeing each other or sharing the same kind of, stories or whatever.
Yeah.
And they decide to go into the Army. Let's all choose the Army. We're all going to choose the Army. So they went into the, enlistment center where everybody is there. And they came out and they go, how'd it go? And one of Dad's friends came out a Marine. One of Dad's friends came out in the Navy. One of Dad's friends came out in the Air Force, which was part of the Army. And Dad was the only one that stayed to the Army. So, he's true to his word. We've learned in Mom's, of course, description and what we grew up with. He's an honest man. And if he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. So he stuck to his guns on there.
Yeah, you wonder what happened to the other guys. I'm sure the recruiting guys influenced them somehow and convinced them to join their branch of the service, because there's always a competition between the branches of service. So yeah, it's interesting that he ended up doing what he said he was going to do, and it worked out for him. He came back at least. Yeah,
we're happy about that. So shortly after enlisting, I imagine the next step would be boot camp. What have you learned about boot camp?
Yeah, so it's interesting digging through his papers. You can see that he enlisted on November 15th, and by December 6th, he had to report. And he first reports to Fort George Meade in Maryland, and that's the induction center. So I'm sure that's where you get the haircut, the physical, and all those things. So that's his first stop. And I was thinking about him, just turning 18. And, he didn't come from any money. His family was pretty poor, big family. Lost his mom when I think he was 13 years old. He had lost his mom. Yeah. So he probably hadn't ventured out very far outside of Pittsburgh. And here he is probably jumped on the train, ends up in at Fort Meade in Maryland, goes through his physical. And then the paperwork shows that they shipped him off to Camp Croft in South Carolina for boot camp and basic training.
Hey, I wonder if they shipped him off to, and maybe they had other reasons, but if they do it where they like shift people off to areas that they might be going to, like South Carolina is more of a warmer climate. Could he have been gone to, Italy or Africa, or do they ever consider that? Have you ever seen any of that in the training?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know why they sent him there, and maybe it's just logistics that if you got East Coast guys, and I know Pittsburgh's not on the East Coast, but it's an eastern,
for sure,
it's an eastern state, and so maybe they send people there, and then if you're on the other side of the Mississippi, you go to another place. I'm not sure why they used Camp Croft, and I don't think Camp Croft is even a functioning base any longer. I think it was maybe fairly temporary for World War II. But yeah, that's where he was, and I found it in his things a photo, and it's kind of like a graduating class photo, I suppose, and it's the guys he trained with. And Dad's so funny, he circled in the photo and wrote me, which I thought was really kind of cute, which is what an 18-year-old would do, right?
Yeah.
You're not, you're not a full man yet. You might think you are, and you just went through basic. But I thought it was kind of cute that he did that, and we still have that photo today of all those men.
I think it's very easy, and I know I've done, to think of these guys, these young men fighting this war, as being so much more mature, so older and wiser than they really are. I mean, 18-year-old, 19-year-old kids, they're stupid. I have had them in my life. I've raised them,
and I've been one.
Yeah, exactly. And I definitely wasn't as sharp as this. So just to think about these guys, and and I'm glad that we hold them to a high standard, because they did so much for us. But we forget at times that they're just kids. They're just kids. What else did you learn about maybe the basic training stuff that he went through?
Yeah, before I jump to that, I just want to kind of give a little sidebar on that.
Please.
Speaking of age. So my brother-in-law, Travis Martin, his dad was in the South Pacific and was a scout. And when his dad went in, I think his dad was in his late 20s or early 30s. And all the younger guys would call him Gramps. And he's a lot younger than we are now, and they'd call him Gramps. And he was the old man of the troops, and they looked up to him. And boy, there's a lot of stories there. If we had more time, I'd get Travis on and tell you all these South Pacific stories. But
so they called him Gramp, and you just became a grandpa this year. So that's what a real grandpa looks, right?
Yeah, that's a real grandpa. The Trav's dad was he was an older man, but boy, he did some interesting things in the South Pacific, and he came back. Yeah.
I wonder, do you know much about the guys that needed more specialized training? Were they always older, like the pilots? They were young 18, 19-year-old guys. Were they the older guys, the 20s, the 30s guys?
I think they were a little bit older. I don't know that they were a lot older. I think that some of them were in college. You had to have good math skills and things like that. So I don't know how they picked and chose those guys, but I do think they were just a little bit older. Yeah.
And I'm sure if you had any kind of flight training or anything, and who did back then, really? I mean, it wasn't widely used.
Unless you were a crop duster or something.
You're a farm boy and doing that back on the farm, the family farm. We'll hopefully do some research and find out more about that. So let's get back to Dad's journey. He goes to basic, not basic training, but he went to the camp to get checked in and all that kind of stuff. And then basic training starts. Tell us about that.
So he does basic training at Camp Croft in South Carolina, and I think that lasted probably about 6 months, maybe 5 months. And so I'm sure it was pretty intense. And of course, he's an infantryman, so he's learning how to shoot the M1 Garand. But as I went through his belongings that he left behind after his death, that he just kind of had in a cigar box and stuff like that, I came across some notes. And I started looking at them, and I can tell it's Dad's handwriting. And at the top, it says Johnson LMG. And so I had to look that up, and it's a Johnson light machine gun. And he had listed, all of the parts to it. He probably had to dismantle it and know how to clean it and put it back together again. And he never mentioned in all those years that he did anything other than carry a rifle. And so I don't know where that Johnson light machine gun came in, and I've never even heard of that weapon in World War II, really. You hear the Browning automatic rifle, and of course, the traditional machine gun, but a Johnson light machine gun, I have to look into that, see what that was.
Yeah. And, I just thought they just got M1s and that was pretty much it. And then I don't know if it was used in World War II, but the rifle that is the JAR rifle, do you know what that stands for?
I don't.
Just another rifle. JAR, and I couldn't believe it when that's what they called it. The JAR is just another rifle. So we'll have to see if that's used in World War II or in further.
Yeah, I did not know that. Yeah.
What else? And what other stuff did they get issued? When they were getting ready to kick off.
Yeah, so it was interesting. I got the chance when I was at Omaha Beach at the American Cemetery. There's a great museum there when I did my European travels, and they have a dummy kitted out entirely. They have a paratrooper for the airborne division, but then they have an infantryman too. And so, of course, I took pictures from all sides and it was great to see. But I would look at what that mannequin was wearing, and I would remember Dad's stuff like that. For instance, the boots, that they were kind of a leather, but it seemed like a suede leather almost, which didn't seem right to me.
Yeah.
And I remember Dad brought his army boots home after the war, and they were always kicking around in the house somewhere, and I used to put them on to shovel snow in them, and they were not very waterproof. And now to this day I think about him in the Battle of the Bulge, where it was snowy in that December when he's in Malmedy in Belgium, and I'm like, man, these are the boots. I hope, they did have overshoes they finally issued to him, but a lot of that equipment didn't catch up to those guys in time because they got caught by surprise. So,
and their warm jacket or their warm coat was a wool jacket. Is that it? Is that, I know we'll look at it a little bit later. Behind you, is that a dress jacket? That's not a fighting jacket, right?
No, that's a dress jacket. That's the Eisenhower jacket that Dad had, and that's part of the dress uniform. That it's in pristine condition still too.
I can't wait to take a further look at that. But when he's out there fighting, they just had wool, right? Their warmth was made from wool, not down and all that kind of stuff.
No, they had wool pants, and I think their jackets were canvas. Which that stuff holds water too. So they didn't have the waterproof materials like we certainly did, and I think they had oiled canvas, which was supposed to be somewhat waterproof. But yeah, looking at what they were kitted out with and seeing everything, I'm sure he was issued all that equipment before he shipped out.
So let's talk a little bit about that. How long from basic training to when he's actually off to join the other guys over there and get in?
Yeah, so if we think about, he's in December, he checks into Fort George Meade and does the physical, and then he's off to Camp Croft, figure by mid-December. So he's in Camp Croft from mid-December till about mid-June. So that's your 6 months of training or so. And so he ships off on June 16th, 1944, and he sails out of New York, and he's heading over to England.
Wow. Have you learned anything about how that trip went?
Yeah, so I was able to research and find the ship he was on, and it's the troop ship called the General William Mitchell is what he was on, and I found the statistics on it, and it could hold over 5,000 passengers. So there's a lot of troops on that ship, and so the way they would cross the Atlantic is they'd have maybe, I don't know, 15 or so troop ships. And then I think, 4 to 7 destroyers that would go with him. I'm not a military guy, so I don't know if it was destroyers or whatever, but it was something to protect the fleet as they crossed the Atlantic, because the German subs were out there hunting them down. So I remember one of us asked Dad, "Were you ever scared?" And he said, one time I was the most scared was when I was crossing the Atlantic to go to the war. We're like, "What do you mean? You're in a boat? Why are you scared?" And he says, our ship had mechanical issues and could not keep up with the fleet. So we kept falling further and further behind. And he goes, they did leave one of the protective ships with them, but it had to kind of zip back and forth between the rest of the convoy and then circle back to them. So there were times where they were left kind of all alone in the middle of the Atlantic. And he thought for sure they were going to get torpedoed. He was just scared to death. He'd never even make it to England.
Just, the fear, because they all knew about the U-boats beforehand, and they took down some British, vessels that were getting, their servicemen places. Yep. So they know that existed, and just be falling back more and more and not having the protection of the full convoy as well as those ships. It's just had to been extremely scary,
Oh, absolutely. And there was tons of torpedoing going on out there, not even just troop ships, but supply ships were shot down all the time too. So it was dangerous to cross the Atlantic, and in those days it took about 2 weeks to cross.
That's incredible. So that takes us to his arrival in Europe, right? Do you know where he went?
Yeah, I didn't know this until just recently when I looked up the ship that he was on, where they docked, and they actually docked in Liverpool, and they got there on June 16th, or no, they left on June 16th. They arrived on June 27th. I've seen some other information that says June 28th, but we're splitting hairs. So it took till June 27th for them to get to the UK or Great Britain, and he got off the ship in Liverpool. And then I kind of lose track of him for a while. I don't know exactly what's happening to him in Liverpool. here's this 18-year-old, and on his papers, I looked it up. He was 5'6" and about 128 pounds when he was enlisted in the Army. So he's not a big guy,
No.
And so here he is in England. I can't imagine coming from Pittsburgh, his eyes were wide open just riding the train to Maryland,
Yeah.
and now he's crossed the sea and he's in a foreign country, and his training continued in England as they prepared him for whatever assignment he would get. And one of the things I found as I read through his paperwork is that while he was in England, he got the Sharpshooter designation as a rifleman. And so I looked that up, and what that means is he scored 160 out of a possible 200 points when they shoot at targets from different positions over a certain period of time. I think it's like 35 seconds or something. They have to fire and reload. So yeah, he got the Sharpshooter designation, and
he's a good shot.
Yeah, well, and you probably don't remember this because you're 10 years younger.
Yeah.
But when we were kids, when we lived on Delaware, do you remember the incinerator in the backyard?
For sure.
Did we still have that?
Sure. Yeah. That and the clothesline that we run our heads into all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. So Dad would take the old wooden matchsticks that had the sulfur on the top with the red below them, the big kitchen matches.
Sure.
And he'd line them up on the incinerator, and then we'd sit on the porch, and of course, he'd take the BB gun that he bought us for Christmas, and he'd show us how he could shoot. Well, he was such a good aim, and I'm not lying. He could shoot that BB gun and just tick the top of that matchstick and light it on fire without just obliterating the matchstick. He'd tick them and catch them on fire, and that's just has stuck with me all these years.
That's crazy. I had no idea you got that designation as a sharpshooter.
Yeah. Sharpshooter, yeah.
That is crazy. All right, so he arrives in Liverpool, and I think we're going to have to pick it up there. Our next episode is Boots on the Ground for our World War II dad.
A special thanks to our World War II mom, Patricia Cangilla, for helping us out.
Incredible stories from a remarkable person. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening to our World War II dad. Please remember to like and subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss an episode.
And if you're just listening to the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate it.